He prayeth best who loveth best, all things both great and small. For the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all. This is Pints with Jack, Season 9, Episode 29. Jack's Bookshelf. Coleridge. After Hours with Dr. Carolyn Webber.
Have you been looking everywhere, searching for a place where you belong? Away from the masses, among clinking glasses, where the hearth fire is on. Let the laughter welcome you in, that eagle and child din. There's room at this table, so take a seat and tuck right in. For Pints with Jack. Pints with Jack.
Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack. As we near the end of Jack's bookshelf, we return once again to the Romantics. This time, we're looking at Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which is why today's opening quotation was from The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And joining me today is returning guest, Dr. Carolyn Webber. Dr. Carolyn Webber is an award-winning author, popular professor, and international speaker, and she's the author of Surprised by Oxford, Sex and the City of God, and Holy is the Day. She has served as faculty at several universities and was the first female dean of St. Peter's College, Oxford. She lives in a quirky old house out in the country with her family, along with their animal menagerie. Dr. Webber, welcome back to Pints with Jack.
Thank you. It's so fun to be back.
Yeah, whenever we get on to do a recording, I always make sure I pad a little bit of time because we have a lot to catch up on.
We do. And there's always so much to talk about with the Romantics.
Well, exactly. But let's catch the rest of the world up on your life. You were last on Pints with Jack in Season 8 to talk to us about another romantic, Wordsworth. What have you been up to since then?
Oh, gosh. Since then, between Wordsworth and Coleridge, that's appropriate, I think. I'm continuing to teach at New College Franklin in Franklin, Tennessee. We love that. Such a wonderful little Christian nonprofit college and just a delight there. I'm just finishing my next book entitled 4 Questions, the 4 questions that God asks us. So I've been looking at the art of asking questions and actually all the questions that we ask of God. How is he asking those of us? I've been very much interested in spiritual formation, spiritual direction. So I had a wonderful experience of being an Inklings Fellow all last year as well. And so I had a chance to work at the Wade Center, particularly on Lewis, but also on George MacDonald. So I've been doing quite a bit of work on MacDonald and some Inklings work in Sayers as well over the last year too.
Lovely. Well, in your honor, I am opening up a Canadian lager.
Oh, thank you. It should be more alcoholic than the U.S.
Yeah, here we go. A little bit of Moosehead. You drinking anything?
I am having my tea.
Perfectly acceptable. I
have my tea throughout the day, and I would be asleep if I had anything with alcohol in it. I'm a cheap drunk now, but in the evening perhaps, but I definitely raise my teacup.
Well, cheers.
Cheers.
I didn't actually originally plan for this serendipity. I literally have a list of people in Jack's bookshelf that I want to get through, and literally Coleridge was the next one on my sorted list. But we've actually already mentioned Coleridge this season because our core text has been The Abolition of Man. And that book opens up with Lewis discussing an incident with Coleridge and the description of a waterfall. Should we call it pretty? Should we call it sublime? So this is perfectly timed. But we said a few things in our opening episode on The Abolition of Man about who Coleridge was, but can you fill out that story? Who was he, and where does he fit into the world of literature?
Well, I think he's famously paired with William Wordsworth, so that's why it dovetails well. But Samuel Taylor Coleridge, his father was an Anglican, had worked in an Anglican church, and I ended up being the master, I think, of a school. So, and he'd been married twice. So if I remember correctly, I think Coleridge was the youngest of something like 10 children. So had lots of siblings, was not as close to his mom growing up. So he'd been exposed to the Anglican background. And I think religiously wise, this would have been in Devon. He was very much formed by that, fell away to the Unitarian, had a brief Unitarian sort of tryst there or a year or two, and then returned and became highly committed to the Church of England. But he's a really interesting person, I think, much like Lewis, read a lot as a child. was really formed by reading and by his imaginative stance. He'd had poor health as a child too, so that was increasingly worse throughout his life. So he ended up most famously becoming dependent on opium, but really understandably as well, laudanum, because of the pain that he lived with and the chronic condition. And so sometimes that's associated with, his creativity in that too. But he was somebody, I think, very familiar with, on one hand, great creative joy and interest in reading and loved to read and learn widely, but he also had depression and chronic pain and illness and isolation in many ways. He's such an interesting person too. I gravitated to him, I have to say, secretly more than I do to Wordsworth. I love Wordsworth, but I think Coleridge is my secret crush. Coleridgean. Because I think he was also very prolific in lots of different genres. So he was a theologian. He wrote essays. He wrote lectures. He was well versed in the metaphysical poets. Wrote the famous lectures on Shakespeare, but also accomplished in literary criticism and in poetry. So very prolific and very philosophical, greatly influenced by not only the French Revolution and those ideas, and actually at one point had wanted to start a utopian society with his friend Southey. Their plan was to go off to Pennsylvania and have this utopian sort of community that didn't quite form, but he had these, really interesting ideas and empathy with the revolution, and was an abolitionist too, and had written for that cause and supported that cause. But he also had this great philosophical bent, and I think much more of a kind of an interaction with what we sometimes call dark romanticism or the Gothic. When you mention the waterfall, the sublime, why an event like that was not pretty, but sublime for him. So he also opens up, I think, a whole lens into the fact that, for him, the imagination is not necessarily formulaic or reliable or perhaps redemptive, restorative like it is for someone like Wordsworth. I think it's mysterious. It can lead us to some places that are, but some places that aren't. And I think also just so much more interest in the symbol of the world, that so many things are speaking, God's speaking to us through so many things at many times. So I think for him, the poet is a much more, still a sense of a holy figure, of a mystical figure in a way that was not the case for Wordsworth.
Now, you mentioned he was paired with some of the other romantics, but what is it that makes him in particular such an important author?
Well, for one, he was greatly revered. As I mentioned before, very prolific, very well read, moved in a lot of circles, and had a great influence. We tend to think of the romantics as first generation and second generation. So the first generation shaped, by the French Revolution, the earlier writers, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Austen, Blake, William Blake, that kind of group. And that group, though, very much having an influence, interestingly, on the second generation, because it's still this longer generation. So it was, Byron and Shelley and Mary Shelley, those writers, so influenced by reading Coleridge. And they were by Wordsworth as well, and as were others. But I think with Coleridge, there was, again, such the effect of the literary criticism too, his understanding and approach, dissecting what the imagination was, that he wrote other works like the Biographia Literaria that talked about how the imagination functions, but also this mystical or lots of different genres in his poetry. So for example, the ballad, the supernatural ballad, I think about the great impact of something like The Ancient Mariner. Mm-hmm. There was an impact, of course, on the lyrical ballads, it being one of the most revolutionary publications ever in 1798, and that common language for common men for Wordsworth. But for Coleridge, yes, agreeing and working on that project with him, but that still the language would be appropriate to the situation as well. So he was still using or appealing to folklore and archaic language, and the sense that the language would be appropriate to that subject. So his ballads, Christabel, these kind of things that really, I think, influenced particularly the growing Gothic of the second generation. So Mary Shelley, for instance, cites very famously, she weaves the Ancient Mariner throughout Frankenstein, right? But she gives that wonderful anecdote of listening. She was supposed to have gone to bed when, as a daughter of Godwin, and Godwin was good friends with Coleridge, and Coleridge had come over to recite the Ancient Mariner. And she was supposed to have gone to bed, but she hid behind a curtain so she could listen. And she still remembers that recitation, and that very much haunts all of Frankenstein. So that really profound direct influence of Coleridge's quite mystical and I think philosophical imagination on those writers.
Hmm. When did you first come across him?
Oh gosh. I mean, I read him in high school. I mean, my mother read poetry widely too. I really identify with Malcolm Guite in terms of his love for his mother and introduction to poetry. My mom read us poetry all the time, and she loved many poets, but Coleridge was one of her favorites as well. But I was more familiar with probably the conversational poems, the ones that This Lime Tree Bower, My Prison, Fears and Solitude, Dejection and Ode, like the conversation type poems. I did know The Ancient Mariner from a young age, and it had me spellbound. I always was spellbound by it. But as I studied it in high school, I remember the first time reading Kubla Khan, and I think like many people thinking, what is this? Right. And T.S. Eliot's idea that, a poem is an experience, not, something that you can logically read through. I thought, what is this? But it was when I removed the barriers of approaching it logically and thought about that kind of mythopoeic approach. It resonated with me later very much when Lewis writes about how the opening lines to Kubla Khan were sort of this introduction of the sublime, of the sense-hooked, of this longing in a way I couldn't define. And of course, the ending of that poem, the poet being the Vatic figure, the poet that can see into things somehow differently, the weave the circle round him thrice and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. I thought, there is a vision that he sees, that the poet has, that can't just be cultivated by works alone, by practice alone, as Wordsworth might say. There's actually also some sort of gifting or revealing or revelation or an opening of the eyes and heart, a Blakean sense and a Yeatsian sense too. I think of, and again, of course, a very Christian sense of an opening of the eyes in a different way.
Now, no doubt he'd have been influenced by the other romantics, but who were his chief influences?
I would argue he was incredibly well read, right? Very, very erudite and very well read and had studied much. And even though he went on to choose his college and couldn't finish his degree because of lack of funds and the illness he struggled with too. But I would say by the time I got to Oxford and really studied him solidly in my MPhil, I was looking at the influence of the metaphysical writers on the romantic writers. And I realized just what a great influence the metaphysical poets had on Coleridge.
So who would those have been?
I would say the number one influence for him would be John Donne. Yeah. Writing on his lectures, being really moved by his poetry. And I think also an affinity with Donne, with that struggle with faith. That doesn't mean that necessarily you don't have it. And it doesn't mean that it is a doubt that can't come and go. But I think it's really at the heart of something like The Ancient Mariner, that times, and as Lewis says later, that times that our prayers are dry, that there's, water everywhere and not a drop to drink, that we can be surrounded by the gospel or surrounded by scripture and still feel lost or hungry or thirsty. I think Donne gave him that permission to wrangle with God, think a feeling and feel a thought in a genuine, honest way. And that's what I see really permeating through Coleridge's own work as well.
Well, speaking of his work, can you give us a sketch of his corpus? I hadn't realized until I was preparing for this episode the variety of stuff that he wrote. I knew him just chiefly as a poet, and then I'm discovering these essays and wrangling with metaphysics. It's like, oh.
Right. And such an earnestness, I think as a young man, as I said, such a voracious reader, really interested in what was happening with slavery, with freedom, with democratic ideals, with utopian structures, possibilities, like politically thinking along those ways. His earlier poems being the poems that we see that he produces in the 1790s with Wordsworth, lyrical ballads coming at 1798, again, 1800, 1802, the ways that he even tweaks The Ancient Mariner with the ancient language and then the glossary. His earlier poems, a real draw to legend and folklore, and an interest, I think, in Catholicism and in old nationalistic stories and in, not only myth, but, kind of like what Jane Eyre accuses Rochester of what England is now missing, like that sort of fairy likeness, that appeal that he still has to those things. But then he decides to go to Germany to immerse himself in the German philosophers, and he learns the German language. I mean, it's incredible. He immerses himself and becomes absolutely proficient in it. So, I mean, he really immersed himself in these things, and then being affected by transcendentalism and, German romantic philosophy and thought, and the dramatists as well, and Goethe and everything. So he had so many different shifts in his life in which he fully immerses himself passionately in that time frame. He dies so much earlier than Wordsworth. I mean, Wordsworth, I think, is 1850, and Coleridge's health was always more frail, and he struggled with that. And that was always a backdrop in the struggle with the opium addiction. So he dies 1834. Not as robust a life in a sense, right? There's Wordsworth delivering the mail, long walks, living on and on. But, but Coleridge was a great walker too. But I think what's interesting is this history of his is marked by these intense interests in things. So you get these poems, the conversational poems, the poems about how the mind is working, the outer and inner, the objective and the subjective, which is really at the heart of Kantian ethics and through to the Romantic movement. And in his conversation poems and things like that, Frost at Midnight's one of my favorite poems. But then with that grows still alongside this return to the Church of England and Trinitarianism, and actually I think a great interest and attraction to Trinitarianism because it is a model in a sense of the tripartite God in the imagination as well. And that's where you get then something like Biographia Literaria in his famous discussion or identification of the primary and secondary imaginations. And that incredible notion that, we as creators are creating the eternal in our, like the infinite in our finite minds. So I'm always amazed by him publishing so widely and differently across all these areas, traveling to these places as well as he's doing it with this poor health, at times taking time out, even in Malta, and that to like help his health get better, struggling with a lot of pain and discomfort while he's doing this. And yet still being in the center of this coterie. Many people traveled to see him. Piercy Bysshe Shelley famously went out to visit him and missed him because he was out on a walk. And he said, if I had been here, maybe I could have talked him out of being an atheist. He was just kind of cut through all the lines. He was beloved by so many and respected by so many in so many different ways. But, the guy also published his Marginalia. I mean, that's, his Marginalia was incredible and rich and thoughtful on top of, the literary criticism he was writing. So the other, literary criticism and lectures and things he was writing as well. So he's really, really interesting. And it changes through that, a shorter lifespan, but I think these very intense periods of being committed to something he's exploring.
If anyone's out there listening wants to do a book, I would like to see a book specifically on the concept of marginalia, because I've now looked at the marginalia for Lewis, Chesterton, and I've heard stories of other authors. I think that in itself is a subject that could be wonderful and also hilarious. Be they Chesterton's doodles or Lewis's savage put downs in the margins. I think we need a book dedicated to that.
I would love that too. I've often said to my students, Augustine says there's two types of people, city of God and city of man. I think there's also two types of people, those who write in their books and those who don't.
Yeah.
And I had my eyes open. I felt really vindicated because I'm always chatting with my book. And when I saw Lewis's own marginalia, at the Wade Center in his books, his interactions and things with them, but also how neat that is, what a palimpsest that is of, writing your thoughts in someone else and then somebody inherits that book, because he does tell his brother at some point, Warney, that his books are more endearing to him because of his brother's notations. So it is kind of you're right, it's a very interesting genre.
Yeah, he says something to the effect of it's almost as good as sitting down and talking with you about a book. Right. The fact that I get to read a book that you yourself have annotated.
Right. It's delightful.
Well, let's circle back to, I think, the three main works that I know him for. You mentioned the Biographia Literaria. Mm-hmm. What actually was that? I mean, from your description, it sounded an awful lot like Mind of the Maker by Dorothy L. Sayers?
Well, Mind of the Maker is much more succinct, although it is, complex as well. And I love that work. And Sayers is another example, of writing across many different genres. And theologically, she's putting forth too, in a sense, that our God is an orderly God. And when we are making and creating, and we are making chaos out of order, in a sense, we are like these many makers, which is also why Coleridge is such a huge influence on Lewis. Many of his own creative work, but also his essays, The Abolition of Man, and that sort of thing is really much focused on that notion of us creating with our own I ams, our own many I ams, the infinite I am. But Biographical Literaria is much more, I think, all over the place, like much of Coleridge, much more extensive. There's just a very famous section. I think his chapters 13 and 14 are quite famous among Romantic students. So it was when I got to Oxford that I had the delight of having Jonathan Wordsworth, the professor at the time, who was a descendant of Wordsworth's, who really it was a delight to learn from him about Coleridge, but just how informative that concept of the imagination was. And in a way, by that time he's writing in 1817 or so, it's such a compilation of German philosophical thought and previous, right? Lockean and that as well. But this idea of all that coming together, and he makes this distinction between the primary and the secondary. And so I think that that's such a key concept. Actually, Barbeau talks about it too, really, in the wonderful book about The Last Romantic, where he looks at the influence of Lewis on the Romantics, but how that, and I would never be able to, remember the quotation exactly, because it is a bit in the Biographia Literaria. It's a couple of paragraphs that are quite philosophically dense, but how Barbeau puts it here is Coleridge famously defined the primary and secondary senses of the imagination in his Biographical Literaria, distinguishing between the creative perceptivity of the primary imagination, and this is a quote, a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation, and the willed creativity of the secondary imagination. And I love this. It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate, or where this process is rendered impossible, yet still at all events, it struggles to idealize and to unify. It is essentially vital, even as all objects, are essentially fixed and dead. Barbeau says such a definition drew deep from the Neoplatonic wells of the Christian tradition, likening the vocation of the artist to the operations of the divine in the formation of all creation. But I think, in which he puts so well, but I agree though too with Malcolm Geit's discussion of Coleridge and his biography and his analysis of the Ancient Mariner as well. That's so beautifully done, of just this, with the literary theory running through this is this divine thread, that we are connected to God through the act of creation. And actually we need the imagination to make sense of things. There's such a tension between reason and imagination, especially for the Romantics. And I think that's exactly what Lewis is also in his own apologetics battling with. But the imagination is the bridge between those two, not only in how we are created in the image of God, but also how we make images and understand the world as speaking, singing always through these symbols to us.
Tolkien would write in Mythopoeia that we make still by the law in which we're made, that the Lord is the creator and we are sub-creators made in his image. But moving on, the two other works that I know Coleridge for chiefly is because Lewis mentions them. The first I quoted at the beginning of this episode, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and the other is Kubla Khan. Roughly, what are they about?
They couldn't be two more disparate poems, which I think really encapsulates him in a way of understanding Coleridge, I guess, when you think about it. Because, not only did he do these sermons and letters and layman work and statesman and, all these other literary criticism and philosophy, but poetic wise, it's interesting that they would be so different, written about 10 years apart. And I think if we start with Kubla Khan, I'd mentioned that before, it is a relatively shorter poem, right? And it's absolutely a dream experience. It's even presented as a fragment or a dream fragment, which was very common in the Romantic period.
The idea of a dream.
And to have a dream or to have a fragment, because then it applied like nothing is actually fully finished. A lot like the Gothic ruins, something is still haunted or in progress, or not pinning down something in a sense. It was still that experience of associated experience of the mind. lots of fragments. And it's really, I think it's often seen as an opium tale too. Was it induced by opium? This sort of thing in the famous Visitor from Porlock, as he's trying to write, and he's always interrupted. But it does have this mystical quality, again, this dreamlike quality, in which kind of like how dreams make sense, but they don't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And yet when you experience the poem and you sit with the poem, you're not reading it as a literal, there is a descent, into the underworld, which is the very typical journey of the poet, right? The Orphean journey, or the journey of any hero to gather truth and to come back up to the surface. It's evocative of Eden. It's evocative of all of these biblical and historical details, but it does not make sense per se. And you have this, flashing to the Abyssinian, the fascination with the romantic Orientalism and the other, and this kind of pastiche of really exotic experiences putting this story together. And then you get to that end that I had quoted, where somehow you have experienced this seeing into something differently, this gathering of a truth that comes to the surface from this kind of crescendo. You don't know how you can put it in words. And so I think it is a very emotive and sublime. And I do agree with Lewis. There's something about the poem that makes you long for beauty and truth and something, a homesickness. And yet you can't explain the poem in a logical sense. It's that experience. Then you have The Ancient Mariner, which is a bit of a combination of both, but The Ancient Mariner is a very long poem. It's a long ballad, traditional form ABCB, and it's in tetrameter, trimeter. So it's evocative of being on the ocean. The Ancient Mariner is at sea, and it tells on one level a story that does make quite a bit of sense. And it's in a frame narrative, which is also very popular in the Romantic period. So it's like a Russian doll effect. Frankenstein works this way as well. There's a story within a story, within a story. So these guests that are going to a wedding are interrupted, and one in particular is grasped by this ancient mariner, this gray bearded loon, crazy person at first, who feels compelled to tell him the story. And we get transported into what Coleridge calls the willing suspension of disbelief, that when we enter into a play or a story, we are willing to hold our reason at bay to enter that story. And then we hear this ballad story about this ancient mariner's journey on a ship that slowly then, as a result of him shooting the albatross, however that's interpreted as sin, as transgression, is then left alone on this wide, wide sea. And the consequences of sin, the consequences on his other sailors, his other mates on the ship, and then this ghost ship, and then this redemption story. So in one way, it works very much in the 7 parts as a fairly clear allegory of the soul. I think that tradition of the psychomachia, which comes straight out of John Donne and the other metaphysical writers, of a battle with the soul, with itself, with God. This mariner left out in the sea, exposed until he does penance and comes back to an understanding of what repentance and relationship with God is. But on the other hand, it's also a trip. So it's a trip and it's a trip. There is this story trip we can follow of where he's journeying away from the village and the church and then comes back on the ocean, a very changed, a sadder and wiser man. But we also have this dreamscape trip, right? Very Gothic in a sense. We have life and death. We have death dicing for his soul, the skeleton ship, which comes out of there's German folklore along those old stories too. This kind of sense of the living dead, which is really what we are without grace, but, starts to have this resurgence again, I think, with the rise of industrialization and the fear of the mechanization of our souls and ourselves. We see this again now. Are we zombies without having faith, without having holy love and relationship? And then he's compelled to tell that story as he returns. So parts of it, whenever I teach it, my students are like, what is going on? And what is going on with this skeleton ship? And, this sort of surreal dreamscape effect that's happening. But on the other hand, it is girded with a story you can trace and follow. And again, that ballad is mesmerizing. There's a hypnotic element to it. You, like the wedding guest, are held in the spell. And as a result, as William Blake would assert, and Coleridge very much admired Blake even when no one else was paying attention to him, we are more experienced readers after we read something. There's the innocence and then there's the experience, and we can't unread something. We can't undo something, can't unthink something. We are different. And so you're different having read the poem. And I still to this day have not had a student who has not loved that poem, actually. I think because it really does end up, that little ship tossed on the painted ocean, right, is very much our own souls' lives.
Yeah. And that poem was included in a collection that we mentioned last time when we were talking about Wordsworth, the lyrical ballads, because most of that was written by Wordsworth, but Coleridge's contribution, one of them was the rhyme. But that also included a preface. I've seen it described everywhere as kind of like the Romantic Manifesto. And whenever I've asked about Romanticism, people sigh and went, it's kind of complicated. But I will say, I think that preface at least gave me something to hang on to as I was trying to understand what these people were about.
I think that preface is probably one of the single most important literary documents of our history, and in the sense of, you've had a history of apologias, of defenses for poetry. You have your Horace and Sidney and Shelley later too. This, ever since Plato kicked the poet out of the Republic, it's been an argument to get him back in since. And then you have someone like Seamus Heaney saying, no, poetry can move a tank, like poetry is inherently political. What's interesting about that preface is at once an explanation and an exaltation and a defense of what they are doing with language at this time. And language is always, right, this is what we get, the little green book that inspires the Abolition of Man, called The Control of Language, right? Where whoever rules the word rules the world. And I think it's very much a document about the power of language and where power is situated in language, which is very interesting too, right? In the UK at the any time or anywhere, but this sense of you're having a lot of shifts in regionalism, in nationalism, in development of the Commonwealth. You're having shifts now in democracy and in political approaches. You're having, even the rise of literacy and the rise of leisure and the rise of education and groups of reading. And so when Wordsworth says, okay, we're going to have lyrical ballads, this is a new thing. Lyrical ballads is just in and of itself an interesting title and an interesting premise, but we're going to write in the common language for the common man, for the common reader. And the poet is actually a common person with just these heightened abilities that they've been able to do. So these poems are actually highly accessible, and they're also about leech gatherers and solitary reapers working in the field and little children that go missing in the snow and, little common everyday subjects. And you're right, Coleridge did not write as many of them as Wordsworth, but he wrote more of the supernatural themes, which is what were attributed to him. And ironically, those were actually the ones that were more popular to start. So the collection began with the Ancient Mariner, and boom, what is that? But you have this Ancient Mariner in a sense, which again is not a king or a queen, a great, magnificent Shakespearean figure, but just an old man who has suffered upon the sea and yet has this tale to tell in this antiquated, superstitious, really sort of magical type of old language. And so Coleridge is playing with that to some degree, but making it accessible, bringing back these ballads, because there's still this tension, I think, between the world that's being lost and the new frightening one on the horizon. So it's a really interesting political document about the nature of language, as well as about the role of the poet now. And so when they define poetry as the spontaneous overflow of emotion, right now this emphasis on emotion, but that it is also emotion recollected in tranquility.
Its origin is emotion, but
its origin is emotion, and it's tempered with reason. And now you have also the role of memory, so integral to the Romantics that had not been addressed to the same extent before.
And that very neatly ties us into this season's book, The Abolition of Man, because in specifically that book, specifically that preface, but in everything that we've said, there's an emphasis on feeling, that this is really important to understand and communicate. It's even more powerful than having a plot or a coherent story, that the sentiments are important. And I didn't actually think of this until just now when we were talking about that it takes its origin from the emotion, but it's recollected in tranquility. It's almost like in The Abolition of Man, where you have the belly and the head, and then mediated then through the chest. Because that was really where we began this episode, with Coleridge and his waterfall, and the writers of the Green Book saying, no, what you have said means absolutely nothing. You just said that there's a waterfall and you're just telling me how you feel about it. And that is basically not important. If it can't be empirically verified, or if it's just not a tautology, by definition true, you've said nothing of any importance if you said anything at all.
Right. And that distinction between pretty and sublime is a massive distinction, especially for the Romantics. I think that gets exactly at that, which I think is also a distinction similar to what Coleridge makes between fancy and the imagination. He talks about that when something is pretty or pastoral, it's not derogative. It's just that it has this, sort of calming and lots of pieces that you can see fit in well. But with the sublime, there's something we can't quite fully put into words that is the effect. So it's going to have fear and awe in terms of the old sense of the word awesome. It's going to be like standing on the cliff edge that is both inspiring and nauseating. The kind of vertigo effect. But there's the numinous behind it, that we can't, there's something that can't quite be put into words. And I think that's really what Goethe's talking about with the infinite longing with the Romantics. And that runs all the way through the first and second generation. There's when Wordsworth writes about the emotion that lies too deep for tears, that there's the words that lie too deep for tears. There's something we know is behind that, towards which we're always going for. Now, I think Coleridge saw that having a home in the Christian imagination, but that numinous, that for which we are hungry, we know is there.
Which is now the perfect transition point to speak about Lewis. We said a little bit about it last time with Wordsworth. What about Coleridge and also just the Romantics in general? How did they shape Lewis? Because anyone that's read Surprised by Joy, many of the things that we've said today of what the Romantics cared about, it's very clear that Lewis cared about them as well.
Well, of course, right, because we had mentioned before that Surprised by Joy takes his title for his memoir, and his conversion memoir takes its title from a Wordsworth poem, which is actually a Wordsworth sonnet about feeling joy and turning to share it with someone that you have lost, and then remembering the tomb. And it's such an interesting play with it, because I think it's not only a nod to Wordsworth, who Lewis did appreciate, very much, but also a nod to Christianizing Wordsworth in the sense that the tomb is empty. That's the point of our joy. Playing with that. Wordsworth doesn't go far enough in that, but Coleridge does. Although I think Coleridge does not have I think he has enough poetic humility in a sense to say, I can't reveal, the tomb. I'm not going to be able to state or put into words exactly what makes us shoot the albatross, but we do it. Also, I'm not going to be able to state for you theologically exactly how that we are able to bless the water snakes from such an empty and dry place, but that's what grace is. So I think for Lewis, the impression I've had was this overt appreciation for the Romantics in terms of Wordsworth, and also in relation to nature too. I mean, Lewis was a big walker. He loved nature, obviously. Nature for the Romantic poets was redemptive. It was a guide. It was a place where you went and you learned too that things could be given to you, could be restored. And I think a lot of times about that imagination being redemptive through nature as a guide for Wordsworth. But nature for Coleridge has that effect, but it's a much more interior nature. So if you think about something like Nutting by Wordsworth, that poem where he goes out as a young man and, essentially rapes the trees. That's the language for it, of all their nuts very aggressively as a young man, and collects them all, and then realizes there's this quietness in which all of the forest just sort of speaking to him, of his sort of naive and rash, exploitation of the tree. And then you have Coleridge, who writes this Lime Tree Bower, My Prison, in which he's really grouchy because he's had hot water accidentally poured on his foot, and he has this injury, and everybody else goes on the walk and he's pouty because he can't. But then he imagines nature and he imagines the walk, and he is soothed by that and soothed by the friendship and actually by the memory of nature. And he talks about that too, the memory as well. Now we see that in Tintern Abbey or Wordsworth too. And I know that, and Lewis was a great admirer of the Prelude by Wordsworth. But I think for Coleridge, that connection for Lewis of being able to also have these in your mind's eye as well, and that power of memory, as well as, I think, again, that connection to the metaphysical writers profoundly through Coleridge as well, John Donne and Herbert and others, in that vein.
And from what you've said today, Lewis definitely seems to be tapping into something very similar when he talks about imagination and about it being the organ of meaning.
Right. I think a great affinity with Coleridge, even more so than Wordsworth. As I mentioned before, I think for Wordsworth, there is this triadic structure. If you take something like Tintern Abbey, you're returning to something that you've been away from for 5 long years. And you remember how you were out running around in this pastoral setting and in this beautiful place from your childhood. But there's a lost innocence. There's a sadness. There's a grief because you had this bounding and this playfulness that you don't have anymore. Now you are aware of the sad music of humanity. And yet eventually that comes together with that landscape to create an abundant recompense. And you return as the poet with even more than what you had. But it's a fully making of human imagination, human memory. But Coleridge allows for more spiritual wiggle room in that. And I think also more for the workings of God. He has his Aeolian harp is another example of a poem he wrote, and that metaphor for the mind, that yes, in some ways we are responsible for showing up and having our strings in tune, but there is a Holy Spirit that moves among them that we can't control.
And that is an image that also appears in The Abolition of Man.
Right.
We're describing the person as an Aeolian harp. So the wind blows where it will, but he says there's a difference because we can sort of tune ourselves when we recognize that we are out of tune.
Right. But we're still dependent on the tuner.
And without the wind, we're making no noise.
Right. We are like a ship that is stuck on a painted ocean. We don't move without the wind. And Coleridge had talked he does write at many points and letters and things about when he's been creatively stuck. He does not feel the wind behind the project or in him or coming up underneath him, which I think is something very similar to Lewis. We see that as well, the changing of the winds and also the dry prayers and the dry as dust and that sort of sense of a Holy Spirit that we need to be in tune with.
I did dip just a little bit into Coleridge's stuff on Shakespeare. It's got a very dry name, Notes and Lectures upon Shakespeare and Some of the Old Poets and Dramatists with Other Literary Remains of S.T. Coleridge. Appalling title.
Literary Remains? It sounds so macabre.
Dipping into it, I did get echoes of an experiment in criticism. I came across this quotation here where Coleridge says, readers may be divided into 4 classes. 1, sponges who absorb all they read and return to it nearly in the same state, only a little dirtied. 2, the sand glasses who retain nothing and are content to get through a book for the sake of getting through the time. 3, strain bags who retain merely the dregs of what they've read. Or 4, Morgul diamonds, equally rare and valuable, who profit by what they read and enable others to profit by it also. Maybe it's just because I haven't read too much literary criticism, but as I was going through that, I thought I could imagine Lewis nodding along and adding a few annotations to that in the margins.
Absolutely. And I think too, Coleridge was really shaped by that notion of the palimpsest, which I do think is behind much of the German philosophy, as well as associating that was that notion of the development of the mind. How do we know what we know? Being formed by everything we've read, that nothing is lost. Words build upon words. That, as Lewis, I can be 1,000 men and still remain myself. That idea of the empathy of reading, being able to enter the hearts of many different people and ideas, I think was very central to Coleridge.
And I remember that being a big thing for me in my early 20s after I came out of university, as I started getting rid of books that I had read, because I'd realized I'd been treating them as trophies. It's like, I got through this. And I started thinking about it and realizing that the value in a book is the difference that it made to me, into my soul, into my person. And that's the chief value of reading. shaping who you are, not just proving that you can get through a dry 500-page tome about something ridiculous.
That's so well put, because I think too, as an undergrad, you're trying to do so much and you're trying to get through the required reading, and you are trying to just survive. But when you look at it, you do think what things have lodged, or when you go back to reread. I mean, we are what we read. It is, take and eat for a reason as well. Like there's also the bread, and it becomes, even if we don't fully remember it, parts of how we shape ourselves.
Well, if somebody did want to shape themselves in Coleridge and dip their toe into his works, where would you recommend they begin?
Oh, he has, I don't want to misquote. I think it's a few hundred poems, which sounds like a lot, but that was obviously prolific. I have not written a few hundred poems, but he has so many letters and literary criticism and everything else. I would recommend just reading through his poems, because they're really beautiful and really enjoyable. And they're all so different in a way. His conversational poems, I think, to start, are probably, quote unquote, the more accessible, like in the sense of, Frost at Midnight is, you would identify with this. It's like being up when your baby's up at night. And you watch the Frost performance ministry, quiet ministry. And he has some surprisingly really beautiful domestic poems, poems about home and children, and that, about the imagination at work, quietly God at work, God always being at work. And I think he wasn't afraid to be moody, to be grumpy, to be like, hey, my friends have gone on a walk without me and I'm going to feel bad for myself. And then as I write this poem, I'm actually realizing the gifts that are in it. I love that about Lime Tree Bower. Something like Dejection and Ode, where he will write openly about depression. I mean, that, was really previously unheard of to some extent. And we can say, oh, well, the Romantics are known for being moody and everything else. But to actually speak about depression, I think is really interesting. And to not offer a trite answer in it either, to leave the reader in it as well. But Ancient Mariner, you have to read, have to listen to it. I mean, it's absolutely mesmerizing. And every time I read it, I learn more and more. Just something, it is such a beautiful poem that really does, it really does reflect on where we're at in our own spiritual state. So the poems, I think, are very accessible. But Biographical Literaria is a great read. I mean, I do really enjoy, he has so many different philosophical pieces that come in there. It's quite representative, I think, of a lot of his ideas.
And when we had our episode on Wordsworth, I prepared by listening to the audiobook of The Prelude. And I really liked that way of tackling it. I do find that when I'm thrown at an author that is very unfamiliar to me, it's really helpful to have somebody confidently read it in the way that it should be. I had a little look before, and the same is true for Rime and the Ancient Mariner. You can go to Audible. There are options there if you would like a little bit of help to sort of get you all the way through.
Right. Or something like Christabel as well. Then you do get a sense of the storytelling of it, the effect on someone like Tennyson later. You get the sense of that he had this great respect and admiration for the old stories as well.
Any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
Yes. Read Wordsworth with a lovely cup of tea on a sunny day, and expect the sublime, but it won't happen until you don't expect it. And with Coleridge, you can read it in any weather, and moody or not, but particularly maybe when it is, Ancient Mariner weather, foggy and mystical and magical, but also to have the permission to know that, our own imaginations, ourselves by ourselves, are not our own redeemers. There's much more than meets the eye for Coleridge. And I think that was what Lewis began to recognize as well.
Well, I look forward to reading that to Alexander at some point over breakfast, because at the moment he really likes Ogden Nash. All of his poems he absolutely adores. He really likes the Jabberwocky.
Oh yeah.
I might wait a few more years before we try the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but hopefully not too long.
Even just the cadence of it when they're little, they might enjoy it. Just the cadence.
Well, I have read him Hopkins, and he likes Hopkins because of just how everything sounds.
The sprung rhythm.
All right, okay. I'm gonna have a trial this week. We will see how far we get.
My kids, ballads are always great fun, even with young children. Once you get into something like The Highwayman and that, they're just mesmerized.
Well, I hear the call for final drinks, so thanks again to Dr. Weber for coming on the show. Thanks to our stenographer Julia, our sound engineers Taylor and Sarah, all of our Patreon supporters, particularly our top-tier supporters, Jacob, Alex, John, Ryan, Dan, Jody, Dave, Brian, Meg, Rebecca, Sarah, Mark, Kevin, Paul, Bud, James, Robert, Mark, Matt, Erica, Joelle, Amanda, Thomas, Shane, Becca, Paul, Gary, Stephen, John, James, Kate, Peter, Rowdy, David, and Angela, and of course, to all of you for listening. We co-host We Pray every time an episode is released, and we hope that you're blessed by this one. And if you've enjoyed it, maybe try reading some Coleridge, perhaps over breakfast or in the early hours of the morning while it's still nice and foggy. And you might also perhaps watch the movie adaptation of Dr. Weber's book, Surprised by Oxford, which I noticed a couple of weeks ago appeared on Amazon Prime for free. But regardless, please join us again next week when we'll wrap up Jack's bookshelf and continue going further up
And further in.
Cheers!
Cheers!